have been like enjoying calculating live statistics on the stream. And there's like a couple different stats that we normally calculate, but I wanted to try to prettyfy it. And so this is kind of like a new format that I wanted to experiment with. And so what I was going to do is talk about some statistics with regards to a current underlying, or like a couple different underlyings that are moving quite a bit in the market. Yep. And then I wanted to know what you guys wanted to see more of. First one I wanted to talk about was bonds. So bonds, very big mover over the past 2 weeks. Typically their daily returns volatility is 0.91%, so less than a percent. But the move today, at least like as of a couple minutes ago, was almost 2% up, which is huge. So that's a 2 standard deviation move for bonds. So really significant move to the upside for bonds. There have actually been 6 days in the last 10 trading days with a move larger than 1 standard deviation. And you can kind of see that over here where you have a move down 1.18%, a move up 1.67%, a move up 1.26%, down 1.16%, up 1 point, right? And it's on and on and on. So very big moves to the upside and to the downside across bonds, which is hopefully not a bad sign. I'm personally not trading bonds. I've been scorned a couple of times, but I'm sure bonds traders, especially volatility traders with the volatility of the last couple of, like the last 2 weeks, basically, it's been very prominent for sure. Today's a 2 standard deviation move. And it's like, we've had some ones that are kind of close to that with like 1.67, 1.56. So these are moves that are like a 1 and 1.5 standard deviation moves. So very significant moves. And also a lot of days in the past 10 trading days, like 60% that have had such large moves. In the last like 2 weeks, basically. So pretty significant volatility across bonds. And then something we've already talked about a little bit, which is gold. So gold, not as much drama with gold, but its returns volatility since 2013 is also around 1%. It's down about 0.5% today, so not the biggest move in the world, but it's actually had 4 days larger than 1 standard deviation in the last 10 trading days. So not as dramatic as bonds, but still pretty dramatic moves, especially when you look at the size of some of these. So you have like a 2% move to the downside, 2% move to the downside yesterday. Very, very large move. 1.73% to the upside, 1.33% to the upside, 1% to the upside. So not like the biggest, like the most frequent big moves in the world, but some of these moves just by sheer volume, especially the one yesterday, pretty significant.
Is there a trade that will benefit more for those big moves on those underlyings?
I mean, this is like, with a move like this is where the option buyers who've lost money over is where the option buyers, like those gold bears have lost, like who've been losing money this entire time, finally get to make a little bit of something back, which is part of why that trap is so tempting. But like just statistically in the long term, like this is something, especially like this 2 larger than a 2 standard deviation move is something you do not see a lot. Let's go. I want to look at Coinbase, which like Coinbase is an exceptionally volatile stock compared to some of the other ones that we were looking at. So the volatility for the historical returns volatility for Coinbase is 5.72%. So really compared to like bonds, which is less than 1%, really big amount of like historical volatility that's traditionally seen. So 3.48% today, which is not a standard deviation move, but it's still pretty significant. And when you look at some of these moves across Coinbase, up 3.48%, up 5.48%, up 7.25%, last week up 7%, up 3.6%, up 5.7%. So just like generally very large moves across Coinbase as well as like most of the crypto sector. I think like making a contrarian move is not very, it makes sense, honestly, from my perspective at least.
Especially after those massive days, 5%, 7%.
For sure, yeah.
Today, 3% up and keeps going higher.
For Sedge, its returns volatility is actually 4%. So this is compared to like some of the other ones that we were looking at, very volatile underlying for sure. They're actually, I think because the returns volatility is so big, there actually haven't been any moves bigger than 1 standard deviation in the last 10 trading days, which is pretty interesting. But still some pretty big moves across this. We damn near touched it a few days ago, but no like big, standard deviation moves, which is I think pretty good. When we looked at the Russell, there's actually only been 1 trading day in the last 2 weeks that has exceeded the 1 standard deviation threshold. But again, comparing like what we saw with bonds, the returns volatility for the Russell is 1.52%. So it's pretty big compared to like some of these less volatile assets. So even though it's moving down 1.14% today, it's still not a standard deviation move, which I think is pretty impressive because that is a pretty big move, particularly for a market index. Riot, another very volatile one today. So its typical returns volatility is almost 7.6%. So again, very, very volatile. So even though it's moving about 6.79% today, bearing in mind that these quotes are probably delayed by like 15 minutes, it's still not quite touching a standard deviation move. And there have only been 3 days with moves larger than 1 standard deviation in the last 10 days. But we can see what some of those moves looked like, which is an 8% move, an 8.8% move, a 9.7% move, and 8.39% move. So just a lot of volatility here for sure, which kind of explains why that volatility index, I believe, is so big for this underlying. Nvidia, another fairly volatile one, 3.76%, typical returns volatility. So it's 1.42% move today, fairly large, not that large for Nvidia, actually. It's less than half a standard deviation move. And there have actually been no days in the last 2 weeks for Nvidia that are larger than that, which is pretty interesting because we've had some pretty significant moves to the downside, seeing some of this negative tendency. So 2.7% to the downside, nearly 2.9% to the downside, 2.5% to the downside, but not quite touching that standard deviation mark. We do have Lulu actually coming up next. So Lulu, the standard deviation for returns is 3.13%. Yeah, really intense for Nvidia, right? To the downside. So some of that pretty significant correction, which I'm not terribly surprised by. So looking at Lulu, we have a 3.13% returns volatility. So its move to the downside today is actually pretty moderate. All things considered, there have only been one day in the last 10 trading days that have exceeded that benchmark. But we can see kind of what's going on in here. So we have a 2.5% move to the upside, nearly a 2% move to the upside, 4% move to the upside, and then a little bit of a reversal this week. So we can see that even though it hasn't been a ton of volatility, at least on a daily scale, definitely pretty significant tendency towards the upside. It's also pretty interesting that like gold and bonds were so much higher than this. Like, it's bad when Lululemon is not as volatile as bonds. That's shows you a weird market for sure. So we had Lulu, we got USO, so 2.34% returns volatility, not the biggest move in the world today. And we have seen like definitely a bit of a sell-off across oil. Especially looking at the last 10 days, like the majority of these are definitely down and some of them are pretty big moves, like over 1%. But in terms of actual moves that exceeded the standard deviation mark, not so much. But definitely, especially a lot of downtrends here in USO. So definitely something to do. And we got 2 more. We got Roblox. So Roblox's returns volatility is 5.2%.
We have expected that.
Which kind of expected that, but it's still kind of nutty to see it. So even though it's down nearly 1% today, that's not even like a point. That's not even a quarter of a standard deviation move. That's nuts. And there have actually been no days in the last 10 trading days larger than that plus minus 1 standard deviation. But again, just looking at the volatility, down 3%, up 3%, up 1%, 1.2%, up 1%, up 1.6%, up 2.9%, up 1.3%. So just a lot of just absolutely raging. Damn Roblox. Okay, maybe there is something to it. And then the one which I think is the most interesting is actually Save. So Save somehow kind of looking like bonds, which is weird, but its returns volatility is 3.34%, so a little bit bigger than some of the others that we looked at. It's down 10.5%, which is a 3 standard deviation move. Those are super duper rare. So damn, Save is really feeling it today. There have actually been 60% of the last 2 weeks have been moves larger than 1 standard deviation, so pretty significantly. And you can kind of see that in here. So down nearly 4.5%, up 2.6%, up 3.5%, up 6%, up 5.2%, down 1.4%, nearly up 1%, up 4%, down 10%. So just completely wiped out. Damn, not what I was expecting at all. Save and bonds are just off the handle. Really wild for sure.
What a big moves on Lulu and Nvidia, $400+ stocks.
Yeah.
With a daily return of 3% or higher.
Yeah, so Lulu I'm actually kind of not surprised by, because again, this is kind of like a more speculative stock, which I'm not sure when that transition happened exactly.